Chapter 9 is about change and change leadership. We start the chapter by looking at the forces for change, which can be subdivided into external forces and internal forces. External forces are the subject matter of various other courses, so we won't touch on them here, but you see the list. Things like economic changes, political changes, all the way down to technology. These are macro issues that just about any organization cannot afford to ignore for too long. What's more relevant, I think, to our course is the internal forces that drive the need for change and the actual change. When an organization is performing poorly in terms of how much money they're making or whether they're meeting their budgets or meeting their missions, just the fact of having new leadership leads to a whole different set of processes potentially. So new leadership just inherently almost always is going to be a situation of change, although some leaders, of course, would try to keep the status quo as much as possible if the status quo was working, and then you question why there was a change in leadership in the first place. Sometimes it's just about succession. It just happens after a while because there's only so long that somebody can work in a position and do what they're doing. Low satisfaction, which I typically tie in with low performance, but they are separate issues. The organization could be performing very well, but employees and followers are not satisfied because they're being pushed too hard, they're being made to work too inefficiently, whatever the issue might happen to be that leads to the low satisfaction. Change of mission, that's right for a change leadership style, of course. That's really fundamental. If you're changing your mission, then just about everything else you're doing is going to change, and so that's going to require a new regime and a new top leader leading that. Conflict. If two groups are not getting along, if two leaders are not getting along, then probably eventually what's going to happen is there's going to be a fix to that. And so that's the change itself, is however the organization decides to fix those kinds of situations by replacing leaders, by possibly trying to settle their differences, although that typically tends to be a very tough thing to do. Culture has something to say about how well change is going to be received in an organization. We've already touched on a couple of these issues, so this will sound like a bit of review, but it puts it into the context of culture's effects on receptivity to change. We talked about tolerance for ambiguity and uncertainty as part of the Hofstede dimensions. We found out some cultures have a high tolerance for ambiguity and uncertainty, and so those kinds of cultures tend to see change as probably favorable most of the time because, again, they don't hold anything to be fixed, and they're always looking for a better way, a cheaper way, a more effective way, a more mission-driven way to do things than they're already doing them. They don't take anything as a given. So here in the U.S., we tend to be like that. You go to a country like Japan, the exact opposite. Japan is very uncertainty avoidant, if you remember back to when we talked about uncertainty avoidance as part of the Hofstede model. Point number 2, relationship to and perception of time. Remember we talked about present-oriented, past-oriented, and future-oriented cultures and societies. And so it turns out that the past-oriented and the future-oriented societies are the least likely to welcome change, or in the future-oriented society, it's about planned change. And so they'll welcome change as long as there's a plan behind it, and the plan makes sense, and it looks like it's going to provide for future needs. In a present-oriented situation where we tend to find ourselves here in the United States, mostly because, I would say, of Wall Street, if we're talking about the private sector, the way businesses get managed is to please Wall Street on a quarterly basis, and so you make a lot of short-term decisions that are reflective of a present-oriented modus operandi, and so therefore those kinds of environments are very, very receptive to change just because it's the normal operating procedure. It turns out there are different types of change that organizations encounter. What the differences tend to revolve around is whether the change was purposeful or not, whether it happened to you or whether you made it happen, whether it's responsive or proactive, and then just how quickly the change happens. Those are the dimensions by which all of these types of change differ. So you have planned change where you literally sit down and you plan the change, as the name would imply. You say, okay, in 3 months the organization is going to look like this, in 6 months it's going to look like this, we will have taken these steps, and This is how we will be different. Unplanned change happens to you. So in other words, the environment changes, politicians change, elections happen, laws get instituted, and you have to respond to them rather quickly because you're held accountable for your results with respect to that stimulus of change. Evolutionary and convergent change are pretty much the same thing. What they deal with is gradual change over a longer period of time. The only difference between evolutionary and convergent is that the convergent is more of a planned evolutionary adaptation. So therefore, you have managers and leaders working on gradually changing the organization. And by the way, the key advantage of evolutionary or convergent change rather is that if you have a change-averse culture, then evolutionary change doesn't actually feel like too much of a change because you're doing a little bit at a time. So people's reference points of where they are versus where they were, the gap there is pretty narrow. All right. So again, if you find yourself in an organization that you're just going to be with the same people for the next 10 years or whatever it is, and they're change averse, well, the best thing to do if you need to institute change is to have some kind of a convergent or revolutionary process. Revolutionary is the exact opposite, where the change is so immediate rather that you don't have time to plan, you don't have time to sit down and logic it out and think about the graduation map that you're going to have like you do with evolutionary or convergent change. And so therefore it's highly reactive and it's immediate, and again it tends to be triggered by something happening in the external environment. Could also be internal environment too. All the things we talked about in the first slide that drive the need for change could be revolutionary. And sometimes revolutionary change is good, sometimes it's bad. It would sound from the word like it was always a great thing, but there's plenty of bad revolutionary change where you're having to respond to an environmental stimulus or change that is unfavorable to your organization. Kurt Lewin, who is a famous social psychologist who published a lot in his heyday, came out with a really neat model that describes the process of change. And this is an idealistic notion, meaning not every change process is actually going to look like Lewin envisioned that it would look, but there are typically elements of each of these three stages in any change process, so let's go through them. The first stage of change is you unfreeze your people, which is the stage in which you tell them why they need to change. You establish the need for change. Things like, if we don't change, we will be out of business. If we don't change, we won't be meeting our mission. If we don't change, then our budget's going to get cut. Whatever the issue is, or sets of issues are, this is the time to communicate the rationale for the change, and then also talk about what the actual change will look like, but not in too much detail so that people get lost in the detail or discouraged. You have to release enough information so that people understand at a general level what's going to happen without overwhelming them. Because remember, again, change is overwhelming, and most people don't want to change, and that's just the fact of life that you have to deal with. Stage 2 is actually changing, where you implement the changes, whatever they are. And then 3 is a stage called refreezing, where you provide all the resources that are needed: time, money, leadership, access to people, whatever is needed in the situation to ensure that the changes take hold. Okay. An interesting thing goes on. I'll talk here a little bit about the implementation of software, which is a change process that just about any organization, public or private, has to contend with nowadays. It turns out that the research tends to show that when companies implement new software, they will do a lot of changes right at the implementation, whether we're talking here about an upgrade or just learning a new piece of software that's going to be used across the organization, and it coordinates things. So once the software is implemented or the upgrade is implemented, there's a lot of change happening over a very small time frame. But then after that time frame ends, whether it's a month or 2 months, doesn't really matter, you see very little effort to continue to incrementally improve the organization through the use of the software, meaning learning new features. Part of that's explained by, there's less and less to learn and use, but the other part of it is explained by people who aren't encouraged to continue to keep changing and implementing changes will dodge this stage called refreezing, or they won't refreeze, which means that they'll fall back on old habits or they'll just kind of fizzle out on their change process. So using, I guess, software as an example here, and there's plenty of other examples, whether it's any other human behavior that we want to talk about, or software, you have to support those changes and lock them in. That's why you see the puzzle there coming back together, but in a different format than the unfreezing stage where you started taking the pieces apart. You have to keep those changes in line and supported, and otherwise you will probably revert back to something that you were doing in the unfreezing stage. So some of this picks up on the Lewin model and talks about the things you have to consider when implementing change, things like recognizing the need and communicating the need, motivating followers to understand why the need for change and how it's going to happen. I think the most important piece on this slide is number 3, the resistance you're going to get to change, and how you plan to deal with it. Okay, and so there's a lot of models that talk about how resistance can be minimized. Things like getting important people on board with the change before you take it out to the rest of the organization. Things like doing change gradually. Things like framing the change in terms of the current core cultural values. So again, a whole body of literature out there. We could spend weeks probably talking about how to minimize resistance to change. If you have any ideas, hopefully that will show up somewhere in your postings this week, because it's a vital topic. It's really probably the most important thing when it comes to change leadership, because if everybody's falling in line, then what's the problem with change leadership? There's no problem. You just do it and you're done. Point 4, I think, is obvious. People are the focus, or the source rather, for learning and change. But leadership is too. Leadership and then your followers. Everybody's learning and everybody's changing. And everybody's a source of information, basically, because this is a stage play where everybody is involved, in the cast and the crew and the changes here in the organization. And the last piece we talked about in the Lewin model, the need to support and freeze, or refreeze rather, the new behaviors so that they take hold and continue to take hold well beyond the implementation phase. So despite the fact that just about every organization on the face of the planet does not like to deal with unplanned change, we all know unplanned change is a definite reality. And it's something that's going to affect our organization at some point in the future. So it would behoove organizations to foster an environment that would be more receptive to unplanned change. And so even though it's a painful process for most organizations to do that, it's beneficial because then when the unplanned change happens, you have almost kind of inoculated yourself against the inability to deal with the unplanned change. And so some of the things you can do along those lines are the ones that you see here, things like not becoming too formal or bureaucratic, inflexible. We've discussed that before. Hierarchies, again, are great when everything is running smoothly. When it's not, then it's a disaster. I like points 2 and 3, infusing controlled unpredictability and spontaneity. So, if you're not having any unpredictability or spontaneous changes going on in your organization, then create them, just so that, again, you learn to deal with the process of change and people are inoculated against this phenomenon of sudden and high magnitude change that they're not used to dealing with. Okay, so it's kind of like when you get a vaccination. What do? You prepare yourself for the real thing by doing something in a weakened form. That's exactly what you're doing here, and that's why I call it inoculation. Replacing and rotating leaders, again, easier said than done, because the leader amasses power and knowledge and connections, and there are processes going due to that leader. So most organizations, if they see a good thing is happening, they don't want to mess with it, and so therefore they would keep that leader in power. When the right thing to be doing is practicing more of a rotational leadership style. I've worked for a few organizations where that was the norm, just because they didn't want anybody getting too overly attached to any one position, and they wanted them to be more receptive to change, just as a leader in general. Incidentally, the Buddhist religion has something to say about that very issue, which is that Buddhism does not believe in attachment to objects, things, ideas, etc. And so the Buddhist philosophy would be exactly what you're seeing here, which is don't get too attached to any one process or way of doing things or behavior or anything having to do with management of an organization or leadership. Because then again, when the environment changes or when you change or have to change, then you're not prepared to do so. And that's not what the Buddhist really cares about. The Buddhist just cares about it from a more philosophical perspective, but it's got an application here to organizational management. The last piece there, experiment with new ideas, methods, and processes, I've kind of been saying all along. Again, this is a proactive experiment, not a reactive experiment. And again, most human mentality is that I don't want to fix anything that isn't broke, and so it takes work and energy and convincing to get the organization into the mindset of being experimental. It's kind of a luxury, but if you can afford it, you should be doing it. The next 3 slides deal with resistance to change and the causes behind the resistance to change in an organization, and it breaks it up into 3 main subcategories of causes: organizational, group, and personal. So we'll talk about organizational here and then move on to group and personal. A lot of these issues, again, we've mentioned in passing throughout the course. Things like organizational culture, we've spent a lot of time talking about. Cultures, just by their very nature, are a way of being, and so therefore they do not want to change to another way of being because there's an inertia behind that culture. The first two here kind of go together. Cultures really are inertia. They're all about inertia. Inertia, of course, means that you don't want to change direction. A body in motion tends to stay in motion in the direction in which it is in motion, and a body at rest tends to stay at rest. That's a law from physics that I think applies equally well to organizations. Organizational structures, again, if it's bureaucratic, if there's lots of checks and balances, if it's a bloated structure, meaning lots of layers and decision-making layers, then you're going to have a very big resistance to change. But the quickest changing organizations in the universe, of course, are startups. Okay, right here in Silicon Valley, we've got, 1,000 of them starting up every month or something like that. And all of these organizations are very, very quick to change on a dime when the market need changes, which, of course, in technology is every couple of months, if even that long. So structure size is a big piece of it, and also how you structure yourself within that size. Point 4 is interesting, lack of rewards for change. So, think about it. How do I reward change? What are the drivers that are going to get people to act out this behavior of change? And, we would say it's money most of the time, but it's also about how you structure the money and the timing of the money and the magnitude of the money, how much. And then it's also about other things, about, visibility, about positions, about what the job's going to look like. So you have to think about all these factors. And the key underlying theme is that if there's no rewards for change, you're not going to get change. You have to actually reward it if you believe in the contingency model of rewards, which we've talked about in this course most recently. Poor timing. What are bad times to change? Well, when everything is going well, when people don't see the need to change, when there's already a lot of change happening, to put more change on people's shoulders wouldn't make any sense. There is such a thing as change overload, which is a little bit different than change, fear of change or resistance to change, because that's a thing that happens at a point in time before the change actually takes place. What I'm talking about here is during the change process, when you're actually implementing the changes, to lump on more and different ones and ones that we don't easily understand that don't fit with the current change model can be just too distressing to your followers, and so therefore that's a poor timing kind of an issue. So group norms that resist change are going to be an obstacle towards change realization. And we say this broadly or generally, any group norm that resists change for whatever reason, and again, half the time it's fundamental human behavior, just not wanting to change. The other half the time it's something around a particular issue that becomes distasteful for group members because it makes their job harder typically, and there's lots of ways to make jobs harder. Of course, you've probably been in that situation before. So whatever the group norm is that's holding you back, you have to contend with it. Group cohesion is a separate concept. Group cohesion just talks about how well the group gets along. And this can work for or against you. We've talked about this phenomenon before, where if you have a lot of group cohesion and the group likes your idea or your change idea, then the group can be a very powerful force in getting the change done. If they don't like your idea, they're going to be a very powerful force in opposition to your change paradigm or idea or process. So it really all depends, but the point is groups that are cohesive, they act the same. Birds of a feather flock together, as the saying goes, and so therefore your advantages or disadvantages multiply synergistically and exponentially when we're talking about groups that are cohesive. And the last group of causes for resistance to change are personal causes. Lots of these I think are obvious. Number one is probably the biggest, fear of the unknown. I don't know what my job's going to look like. I don't know how I'm going to be able to do my job, so there's your fear of failure in this change environment once things are different. You will not have a use for me anymore because I'm not competent in the new way of doing things. So we hear and see this happen all the time. People just are afraid of losing their jobs again, and then they probably had some negative experiences with change in the past, and that's going to drive a resistance to change. There's an age factor here as well. We all know younger people are much more open to change. The older you get, the less open to change you are. But then there's also a personality type issue going on here, where the uncertainty avoidant people, we talked about uncertainty avoidant cultures under the Hofstede model. Those kinds of cultures are not going to be welcoming to change, and so if your culture has that trait, you probably have it too as part of that culture. If you're highly uncertainty avoidant, then you just resist change. There's also another factor here that we haven't talked about anywhere along the lines in this course, which is a thing called reactance. Reactance, in a nutshell, is the efforts that human beings make to avoid being manipulated. So if you sense that you're being manipulated in some way, then you will react in such a way so as to minimize the effects of that manipulation or potentially even counteract the manipulation if you can. So we see this, by the way, in things like advertising. Why is advertising so hard to get people to, why is it so hard for advertising to get people to do things? Because people just tune out sales messages because they know they're being sold to. Just think about the last time anybody tried to sell anything to you. What did you do? You probably started thinking to yourself, well, they're trying to sell me something. I don't want it automatically, right away. So anyway, how all this applies to change management and change leadership is that there are some people who are more reactant than others, and those kinds of people are going to resist change just because, again, they are very sensitive to manipulation. And change, of course, is one of the forms of manipulation. So after hearing about all these slides on resistance to change, it begs the question of how do I manage resistance to change? And so, good leaders are good at managing resistance to change, which typically means minimizing it. Eliminating it is never going to happen. It is just too much to ask to eliminate any resistance or every resistance to change. There's always going to be some amount of concern or fear in your followers' minds that the change is not going to benefit them or necessarily even the organization. So you work to minimize the resistance to change. How do you do it? All the things you see here. We've talked about a lot of them, things like participation. Remember, people tend to support that which they are a part of making. So if you get them to participate in formulating the change and executing the change, then they will be that much more supportive of the change and the new paradigm. Facilitation and support behaviors, in addition to being directive, you need to be emotionally available and emotionally directive, if you will. So we've talked about that in the relationship orientation versus a task orientation, which is much more directive. Negotiations, again, you want people to do something, they don't want to do it, so you have to reach some compromises. If you do this, I'll give you that, or if you meet me halfway, we'll give you something of interest. So that's what change winds up being a lot of the time. It's just a series of negotiations where you're gradually increasing or improving the behavior towards the end goal of getting them to an endpoint that looks different than what you started from. And it happens through, again, a series of what I call shaping negotiations, where you're just getting them closer and closer to that endpoint, one step at a time. Manipulation and co-optation. Manipulation sounds like a negative thing, but sometimes it's what you have to do, and it's not necessarily unethical. It's more a matter of framing things in a way that people are receptive to them. Let me give you an example. One of the pieces of research that I uncovered a while back was about changing your operations and what makes for a successful change in operations as far as employee performance goes in that change. And one of the things that was learned in this research was that if you frame the change in terms of education or learning experience, people are much more receptive to it than just saying, hey, we're going to change to make the organization perform better, we're going to change because we have to change, or whatever other reason you want to give. If you frame the experience as an education or a learning experience, then people are very receptive to that. And so it's not lying, it's not being deceptive, it's just spinning the idea a slightly different way so that people start to see, hey, yeah, I could learn something out of this and become a more powerful human being based on my new knowledge base. Coercion you almost never want to use because that's just not the way to get things done, although sometimes it's possibly the only way to get things done, and so you consider using that. We've talked about that before. Last but not least, I kind of skipped over co-optation. That's when you get your enemies to agree with you. So it's kind of like, I shouldn't say enemies, people who are not agreeing with you, who I'm calling enemies here. It's really not a good word. But your opponents, your people who are not adhering to your ideas, you can co-opt them by, again, compromising, making deals, and getting them on your side so that others see that they're following you. And by the way, that's got a bigger effect than a lot of other things, because if your followers see that somebody that was opposing you before now has joined your forces, then people start to say, hey, there must be something to this logic and this new paradigm and this new process that I better get on board with it. Change leadership necessitates having a vision and communicating that vision to your followers and getting them to follow through on that vision. So there's some principles around how to motivate a vision, whatever that vision happens to be, and that's, of course, the first important step is creating the right vision that people are going to buy into and then getting them to buy into it. So the getting them to buy into it piece, if you have a vision that's simple and easy to understand and you repeat it, remember we looked at Lafley's leadership style. He was one of the exercise leaders that you read about, and what he used to do is just say the same thing over and over again. So no matter who he talked to, whether it was other executives or mid-level managers or line managers, he would just tell them the story again and again and again of what P&G needed to do at that particular point, which was listen to the customer, which you think is so obvious and sounds so simple. But doing it required a lot of change and a lot of process change, and so the first step towards doing that is just repeating yourself constantly and really making the need for the change and the actual change steps and end goals very, very clear and understandable. The vision should have goals that are challenging and idealistic, but also realistic. You have to strike that healthy balance, otherwise people think they're just going to fail because the standards are too high. They're not even going to try, basically. Or they'll create the appearance of trying, which is really not good either. So, what does that look like? Well, it depends. I mean, that's a very broad kind of a comment, but basically you have to strike that balance. Motivating visions should appeal to values, emotions, and ideals. Again, these are emotionally tinged kinds of action plans and statements and assertions about what we ought to be doing. It's not just, we need to do this now because we need to do it now. You have to appeal to people's emotional needs. And you have to strike emotional chords with them, because it's emotion that gets people to do things, not logic, believe it or not. Every piece of research I've ever read talks about the primacy of emotion over rational thought. And you would think it would be the other way around a lot of the time, but it's not. It's actually emotion, especially when it's a big thing that you're trying to tackle, big complicated change where lots of people are involved. You really have to stir the emotions. Of course, a vision is going to be forward-looking, otherwise there would be no need for vision. You would have everything you already needed in the present. Part of executing on the vision that you create as a leader is building credibility for yourself. And there are some things you can do to foster the building of credibility that you see here. We've already talked a lot about clarifying values and value-based or authentic-based leadership, and simply saying the same thing over and over again, which can be a result of your values, what you say. But in any case, whatever you do, you have to make sure that followers understand what your values are and how they relate to the organization. Identifying what followers want. Again, if you're coming across as somebody just trying to accomplish goals for yourself and not others and not the organization, well, that's narcissistic and possibly Machiavellian, as we've discussed before, and that just doesn't tend to fly too far or too fast. So you need to spend a significant amount of time focusing on what your subordinates and followers are likely wanting at this point in time in the organization, and what they're not getting, because you can make it a part of the change deal, as I like to say. What have we been neglecting of your needs in the past, and so therefore what can we give you now that you haven't had before? In return, you help us change to this new end state. Agreement and consensus, we've discussed. I won't belabor that. Being enthusiastic, obviously. But remember, again, enthusiasm is a culturally contingent quality. Some cultures like enthusiasm more than others. Here in the U.S., we tend to like it, but it also differs by industry. Enthusiasm in the financial world is not called for almost ever. In fact, just about most of the time, everybody in the financial world thinks that the sky is falling, and they will look with high suspicion upon anybody who tells them differently. But that's just one industry. You go to other cultures, again, Japan, Asian cultures, enthusiasm is not really valued by followers. We've talked about that before. It's not that nobody wants you to be not committed to your goals. Commitment and enthusiasm are really two separate but sometimes related things. You can be committed without being or appearing to be enthusiastic about your goals. Standing up for your beliefs, again, you have a message, you want people to do things, you got to do them yourself, so you have to role model and then show people that you're standing up for your beliefs and the kind of change that you want to see in the organization. And so, as they say, be the change. Some more principles behind visionary leadership and how to accomplish visionary leadership. Along the same lines as being clear on your values, you also have to be clear about what the standards and goals are of the change. I think we've said that before. You have to define the change clearly, make sure everybody understands it and why you need the change. The newer stuff here that I think is more interesting is the personalization of rewards and recognition. To the extent that you can, to the extent that it's not a burden, you want to find out what each individual follower wants from the deal and give them that particular thing if you can. The problem here, of course, again, is variance. If everybody wants something different, does it become burdensome to try to fulfill everyone's needs? But to the extent that you can, this is the time to do it because, again, you're asking for a lot. Change is a lot. It's the hardest thing you can ask people to do. So therefore, the reward requirement need tends to escalate as well. And so to the extent you can personalize, it may not be necessarily more expensive in terms of money, but it might be more expensive in terms of time and effort. But at least you're saving one of the two. Telling stories, not every leader needs to do this or does do this, but storytelling can be an effective way to communicate a principle or a concept or a need or a desired outcome. Stories are friendly. People relate to them. It's one of the best ways to teach people things because people, again, tend to remember things in terms of stories rather than discrete facts because it personalizes or humanizes, I should say, the concept you're trying to communicate rather than just, again, giving you the straight facts, which is not a humanized method of communication. Then celebrations, when things go right, even if it's a small thing. Hopefully it's not a small thing, hopefully it's bigger things, but we'll take small successes too. Celebrate. Have a party, have an outing, have a whatever, whatever your modus operandi is for celebration. recognize and reward successes, and make them public kinds of encounters so that everybody is seeing the success. The chapter touches on creativity and how it can be used to achieve change leadership. The creativity required in the change process is required because you're doing things that you haven't done before. That's the whole idea behind change. And typically, very many components of that change are brand new, meaning you're doing things that are completely foreign to you as an organization, whereas other parts of the change process are new, but somebody else has done them and can give you direction. So the experience is new, not necessarily the process. So therefore, whatever kind of change we're talking about, so creativity is always going to be in fashion and always going to be in need. And so the question then becomes, how do you drive your organization to be more creative? And so a lot of this picks up on some of the concepts we've mentioned before in the course, having to do with participation and empowerment. So like open and supportive leadership and flexible structures with low centralization. That's all about empowerment and participation, essentially. The two that you haven't seen yet probably are things like encouraging questioning attitudes and tolerating mistakes. Remember back to Richard Branson, who we reviewed in a prior assignment for the CRQEs. His attitude was, I don't care if we make money, which is easy to say when you're making a lot of money, but let's take him at face value there. And he's really more interested in just doing things that are fun and that are useful to people, be it his employees or consumers. And he's always looking for the better way to do things as far as establishing the business model and then running the organization. So he encourages a questioning attitude from his employees. He tolerates a lot of mistakes. Mistakes are, nobody wants to make a mistake, but the question is how you deal with the mistake. When you get knocked out in a boxing match, do you get back up again and keep fighting, or do you stay down? Well, that's the same thing with tolerating mistakes. Mistakes will be made, especially if you're experimenting and trying to be creative. How you deal with those mistakes is going to have bearing on whether people continue to be creative or even increase or improve upon their creative potential and then use the creativity to the organization's benefit. Okay, so you have to tolerate a healthy level of mistakes, but also be on guard for when the level of mistakes is getting too high such that you need to say, look, we can't afford to make any more than we are already making. There is such a thing called the learning organization that most organizations should actually strive towards being. It basically means, in a nutshell, that you're learning, as the name would imply, but you're also taking that knowledge and sharing it as broadly as possible so that each employee, each department, each division, etc. of the organization can be its best. You're sharing your current best practices, essentially. So a couple of things go along with being a learning organization. Things like having a shared vision, which the leader is responsible for implementing, creating and implementing. A systems thinking, where when I make a change or I do something, I consider what everybody else in the organization is going to think, how it's going to affect them, and whether they're going to support that kind of change or that kind of process. But you're essentially looking at not just your own unit in which you operate, but how your unit and the changes within your unit and the behaviors and actions within your unit affect other units and then the organization as a whole. That's systems thinking in a nutshell. Personal mastery, mental models, and team learning, I think, kind of summarize a lot of the aspects I just touched on, so I won't go too deeply into them. But notice the kind of dichotomy here between organizational knowledge and then personal knowledge. You can't have organizational knowledge until you have personal knowledge, which comes from personal mastery. So the two concepts are not mutually exclusive. They go hand in hand and complement each other. So we just discussed what a learning organization looks like and how to be a learning organization. It begs the question then, what prevents an organization from becoming a learning or being a learning-driven organization? And so we have a couple of factors here. I think this actually happens to be the most interesting slide in the chapter because I see a lot of this happening in organizations that I've worked in or consulted to. So things like isolated jobs where somebody is working on something but nobody else knows that that work is being done because it's not advertised correctly, it's not showcased correctly, or maybe whatever they're working on is too complex to explain to the other stakeholders. But the point is, isolation does not help. And so, intranets and all the communication technologies we have today that we didn't have before are obviously helping stem the flow of isolation. Ignoring gradual change. So change happens, but it can happen at a small clip at a time, and that's actually a great way to get people receptive to the change. We've talked about that. It's not the only way to do it, but it's one good way. And so you might get into this habit of having change happen all around you over time, but not even noticing it because things are changing so gradually or slowly. The change is not salient, and so therefore you haven't learned because you don't see the link between what you've done and what the output is. And so therefore the leader needs to again call attention to the fact that things have changed, things have gotten better, performance has gotten better in these areas, so as not to ignore the gradual change, and therefore you can bank as knowledge that which you have applied and seen come out in your results. Okay. Emphasis on events. If something bad happens, we focus on it for too long. A setback in our change process. Yeah, you'll have times like that. It's just best to take it in stride and move on. Don't let it affect the rest of your plans. Easier said than done, of course. People get emotionally distraught from interruptions and setbacks and mini failures or big failures in a process. But again, you have to keep the 360 perspective, the bird's eye view, which is we're moving along a path here, and sometimes you have to deviate off the path a little bit to get back on it. Blaming others, I think that one's obvious. If you blame the environment of blame, nobody wants to work there anyway. Nobody's going to learn. They're going to focus on just blaming others back, getting even, rather than working on what they need to focus on, which is the organization and its progress and its processes and goals and outcomes, etc. Skilled incompetence. There are some leaders who are so good at being bad leaders that people actually think that they're good. They just have a way with, again, manipulating people. They can be Machiavellian, they can be narcissistic, but it's not necessarily the case. The point is that they're taking their incompetence and they're getting things really done very well, but it's not what the organization needs. The organization is not benefiting from that particular behavior and the behavior that the followers do based on the leader's direction. So this is what we call skilled incompetence. Okay, you're training people to be really, really good at the wrong thing that doesn't benefit the organization. And that's a block to learning because you think you're learning, but you're not. And that's the issue. You're learning things that are irrelevant and even harmful. The illusion of taking charge kind of goes along with skilled incompetence. This is the idea of a leader who seems really aggressive and assertive, and they seem like they're really changing things for the better and helping the organization perform. But really, they're not really doing much. They're just doing a lot of talk, and they're not doing a lot of leading, and they just project themselves well at the right times. And so they create an illusion of leading when they really aren't. And again, that's going to lead to a situation where there's A, bad management and bad leadership, and B, it's a block to learning.